2023, for the first time in more than 30 years, Australia entered a per capita recession, marking a decline in individual economic output despite national growth. This wasn't just a blip on the radar. It's a stark reminder that the lucky country might be running out of luck. While wages stagnate and inflation surges, the dream of owning a home, once a cornerstone of Australian life, is slipping further and further out of reach. Australia, the land where real estate has become a national obsession and mineral exports fueled decades of prosperity, now faces a growing crisis. The housing market has spiraled into one of the most unaffordable in the world, and the cost of living is soaring, leaving many Australians feeling the weight of financial pressure in ways they never imagined. How did a country so rich in resources and opportunity end up here? What forces have conspired to make living in Australia so hard? In this video, we'll dive deep into the economic factors reshaping Australian life, from the housing crisis and wage stagnation to rising costs that are making everyday living increasingly difficult. But before we do so, please remember to hit that like and subscribe button. As a small channel, this goes a long way. Now, let's dive in. Over the past decade, the cost of living in Australia has risen sharply. While Australia has always been known as an expensive place to live, especially in major cities like Sydney and Melbourne, recent inflation has pushed many Australians to the brink. The per capita recession that began in 2023, the first since 1991, is a clear indication that while the country's overall economy may be growing, the average Australian is worse off. This economic downturn has hit households hard, as wages have not kept pace with the rapidly rising cost of living. Wages in Australia have stagnated for years, with real wages declining by 4.8% since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. To make matters worse, inflation has eroded household purchasing power, driving up the prices of basic necessities such as food, housing, and energy. A recent survey showed that 56% of Australians are now either barely managing to get by or failing to make ends meet. For many, this has meant cutting back on essential expenses, with over half of the population reporting that they've reduced their energy usage, and a third admitting to skipping meals to afford rent or mortgage payments. This financial strain is not limited to just the lower-income earners. Middle-class Australians are also feeling the pressure as inflation eats away at their purchasing power. Household consumption, a key indicator of economic well-being, declined by 0.2% in mid-2024, marking one of the most significant declines in consumption since the global financial crisis. This drop was primarily driven by the rising cost of living and higher interest rates, which have placed a massive burden on household budgets. The financial vulnerability of Australians is further highlighted by the fact that 9% of the population would not be able to cover an unexpected expense of $3,000, underscoring the precarious nature of the average household's finances. At the heart of Australia's economic woes is a severe housing crisis. For decades, the country has experienced one of the greatest housing booms in the world. Since 2020, house prices have surged by nearly 40% nationwide, with even sharper increases in cities like Perth, 57%, Brisbane, 63%, and Adelaide, 64%. Sydney, Australia's largest city, is now the second most unaffordable city in the world, behind only Hong Kong. The average price-to-income ratio for homes in Sydney is a staggering 13.8, making home ownership a far-fetched dream for most Australians. The numbers are similarly grim in other cities. In Melbourne, families need to earn at least $120,000 per year to afford a median-priced home, while the median household income is only around $100,000. This massive gap between incomes and housing costs is pushing more and more Australians into the rental market, where rents have also skyrocketed. In Sydney, rents now exceed $3,000 per month, while in Brisbane, the average monthly rent is $2,500. Renters are finding themselves competing with dozens, if not hundreds, of others for each available property, making it increasingly difficult to secure a place to live. Australia's housing market has become a battleground, with young Australians facing an uphill struggle to enter the property market. Home ownership rates for people under 34 have declined by nearly 25% over the last few years. with many resigned to the reality that they may never be able to afford their own home. Instead, they are becoming lifetime renters, trapped in a cycle of paying high rents while saving for a deposit seems almost impossible. The roots of this housing crisis run deep. While Australia is geographically vast, most of the population lives in urban centres, where housing demand is high. Nearly 76% of Australians live in just 18 major cities, placing enormous pressure on housing supply in those areas. This demand for housing in urban areas, combined with Australia's cultural preference for low-density suburban sprawl, has led to severe supply shortages. Unlike other major global cities, which have embraced high-density living, Australian cities like Sydney and Melbourne have some of the lowest population densities in the world. This has resulted in a massive mismatch between supply and demand, driving up house prices and rents to unsustainable levels. Another critical factor behind Australia's housing crisis is the failure to build enough homes. Despite having vast amounts of land available for development, the country has not been able to keep up with the growing demand for housing. Since 2000, the rate of new housing developments has consistently declined. In 2023, only 170,000 new homes were built, the lowest figure in over a decade. This shortfall in housing construction is partly due to a combination of government red tape and the cultural preference for low-density living. Approval processes for new housing developments are notoriously slow, with it taking an average of 111 days to approve a single home development in New South Wales. In some areas, this wait time extends to nearly 300 days. This bureaucratic backlog, combined with community resistance to high-density housing, has created an environment where new housing construction simply cannot meet demand. What's more, Australia's population continues to grow. This creates a situation where demand for housing far outpaces supply, pushing prices even higher. The lack of available land in urban areas, where most people want to live, has resulted in land prices skyrocketing, making it even more expensive to build new homes. The government has failed to address these issues adequately, leaving Australians in a housing affordability crisis with no end in sight. Australia's tax policies have also played a significant role in fueling the housing crisis. Negative gearing, a tax policy that allows property investors to offset losses on rental properties against their personal income, has made real estate investment an attractive option for wealthier Australians. This has led to a speculative frenzy in the property market, where investors purchase homes not to live in, but to benefit from rising property values. The capital gains tax discounts introduced by the Howard government in 1999 have only exacerbated the problem. These discounts allow property investors to pay just half the tax on the profits they make from selling their properties after holding them for more than a year. This policy has further encouraged speculation, as property owners can make substantial profits from rising property values while paying relatively little tax. These tax incentives disproportionately benefit older generations who bought homes before the property boom. Younger Australians, meanwhile, are left struggling to get a foothold in the property market. The impact of these policies is clear. 50–80% of all investment properties in Australia are negatively geared, a sign that the country's tax system heavily favours property investors at the expense of those trying to buy their first home. Australia's economic troubles are not limited to the housing crisis. The country is also grappling with declining productivity and stagnant wages. Productivity growth, which drives wage increases, has been slowing for decades. Between 2010 and 2020, Australia's annual productivity growth averaged just 1.1%, significantly lower than previous decades. This decline in productivity has meant that wages have failed to keep up with the rising cost of living. Australia's economic reliance on natural resources and real estate has also stifled innovation in other sectors. The country spends just 1.7% of its GDP on research and development, R&D, well below the OECD average of 2.4%. This lack of investment in innovation has resulted in slow wage growth and fewer job opportunities outside of the mining and real estate sectors. As a result, Australia's nominal GDP per capita has stagnated, and real wages have not increased in over a decade. Australia is at a crossroads. The country's housing crisis, cost of living pressures, and wage stagnation are making life increasingly difficult for its citizens. The dream of homeownership is slipping away for many, and even renting is becoming a significant burden. Without substantial changes in government policy, such as reforming tax incentives, increasing housing supply, and investing in innovation, the challenges facing Australians will only worsen. The lucky country is finding that its luck may be running out, and unless action is taken, the hardships of living in Australia will continue to mount. While the country has weathered economic storms in the past, the current situation requires more than just hope. It requires bold and decisive policy changes. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the challenges facing Australia and the global economy.